The dark story of America's most important building, the White House. Stand at the north portico at 3 a.m. The limestone glows against darkness. But look closer. The stone itself was quarried by enslaved hands. The brass doorknobs, polished daily, bear the fingerprints of men who owned other men. Beneath your feet, the foundation settles into earth that was once a malarial swamp, chosen not for glory, but for compromise. Every president has slept in rooms where laborers died during construction, their names unrecorded, their graves unmarked. The East Room, where Lincoln's body lay in state, still echoes with seances Mary Todd Lincoln held to contact their dead son. This isn't just America's house. It's a monument built on contradictions so deep they've literally cracked its walls. The White House has burned, been rebuilt, and slowly sunk into the ground while hosting the most powerful office on earth. But here's what they don't tell you on tours. Every major decision made within these walls has come with a body count. So the question isn't whether the White House is haunted, it's whether a building soaked in this much history could be anything else. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories, dark secrets, and uncomfortable truths behind the world's most famous buildings, like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss any. Tell me in the comments, which building or iconic structure should I uncover next? Your support makes these in-depth investigations possible. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin. The site was chosen because no one else wanted it. When Pierre Charles L'Enfant surveyed the land in 1791, he recommended against building the executive mansion in Foggy Bottom. The area was a tidal marsh, breeding mosquitoes that carried diseases without names yet. But George Washington needed a compromise. Northern states wanted the capital in Philadelphia, southern states demanded it closer to their interests. So they picked a malarial swamp on the Potomac River, midway between north and south, where the oppressive summer heat would eventually drive every president to flee for months at a time. The land wasn't empty. The Nacotchtank people had lived along these riverbanks for thousands of years before smallpox and displacement erased them from the landscape. By the time construction began in 1792, they were already gone, a pattern that would repeat itself in the building's DNA. The White House would be constructed on the principle of erasure. Native land, enslaved labor, and inconvenient truths buried under neoclassical architecture. Scottish architect James Hoban won the commission with a design lifted directly from Leinster House in Dublin. His vision required Aquia Creek sandstone, a porous stone that absorbed water and began deteriorating almost immediately. Workers discovered this too late. The stone wept in humidity and cracked in cold. To this day, the White House requires constant maintenance just to prevent literal disintegration, a metaphor no one requested but everyone inherited. The labor force tells the real story. Enslaved people from Maryland and Virginia were rented to the project. Their owners paid $5 per month per person. These workers, men whose names appear only in payment ledgers as Negro Harry or Slave Tom, quarried the stone, fired the bricks, and laid the foundation. They worked in conditions that killed regularly. When someone died on site, which happened often, their bodies were disposed of with less ceremony than the building materials. No monuments marked their graves. No plaques acknowledged their existence in the official tours. But historical records do exist. The White House Historical Association confirmed in recent decades that enslaved labor was fundamental to construction. Payroll documents show the government compensated slave owners, not workers. Insurance records reveal that enslaved people were valued as property, listed alongside tools and draft animals. When abolitionists later pointed this out, the response wasn't denial, it was silence. The building's origin story was simply omitted from official histories for over 2 centuries. By 1800, the mansion was barely habitable when John Adams moved in. Plaster was still wet on the walls, staircases were incomplete. The surrounding grounds were construction debris and mud. Abigail Adams hung laundry in the unfinished East Room because no other space was available. The building that would become the symbol of American democracy was at its inception a cold, incomplete structure built by people who would never be free to enter it as citizens. The question that haunts historians is straightforward. Can a building constructed on such foundations ever be cleansed of its origins? The limestone doesn't remember, but the historical record does. Every president who has lived there since has inhabited a space where the walls themselves are evidence of America's original sin. Not metaphorically, literally. The stones were cut by enslaved hands. The White House didn't begin as a beacon of freedom. It began as a practical compromise built on stolen land with stolen labor. Understanding this doesn't diminish the building's importance. It clarifies why its story has always been one of contradiction. The residence of the leader of the free world was built by people who weren't free. This isn't a dark secret, it's documented history. The darkness comes from how long it remained unspoken. On August 24, 1814, British soldiers ate dinner from the president's own table before burning his house down. The War of 1812 wasn't going well for America. British forces had landed in Maryland, marched toward Washington, and encountered almost no resistance. President James Madison fled on horseback, while his wife, Dolly, remained behind just long enough to save George Washington's portrait, cutting it from its frame with a knife because there wasn't time to properly remove it. By the time British Rear Admiral George Cockburn arrived at the White House that evening, the building was abandoned, but dinner was still warm in the state dining room. What happened next was documented by British officers with unsettling detail. Cockburn and his men sat down at Madison's table and drank his wine. They toasted Jemmy's health, their mocking nickname for the president, using his personal crystal. One officer stole a cushion from Dolly Madison's chair as a souvenir, later writing that he wanted something to remind him of Mrs. Madison's seat. Then they systematically burned the building to its stone shell. The destruction was methodical. Soldiers piled furniture in the center of rooms, poured gunpowder and flammable materials on top, and ignited them. The heat was so intense that the sandstone itself calcined. The limestone baked into quicklime, causing massive structural damage. The wooden beams supporting the roof collapsed inward. The interior was completely gutted. Only the exterior wall survived, and even those were so damaged that engineers debated whether to demolish the entire structure and start over. But here's where the story turns strange. A massive thunderstorm rolled in the next day, possibly a hurricane, with winds so violent they killed British soldiers and extinguished the fires. Accounts describe a tornado touching down that threw cannons through the air. Americans later called it divine intervention. Meteorologists note that the intense heat from the fires could have created its own weather system, a firestorm generating its own storm. Either way, nature interrupted what the British had started. The decision to rebuild rather than relocate became intensely political. Many argued that Washington, D.C. itself was a failed experiment. Too hot, too remote, too difficult to defend. Why rebuild a house that had just proven vulnerable to invasion? But abandoning the capital would mean admitting defeat. So, Congress appropriated funds, and James Hocken, the original architect, returned to reconstruct his own work. This is when the paint entered the story. The burned sandstone was so stained with smoke and heat damage that no amount of cleaning could restore its original color. Workers applied a white lead-based paint to cover the scorch marks. The building had been referred to as the President's House or Executive Mansion before the burning. After the paint, it gradually became known as the White House, its current name born directly from an attempt to hide its destruction. The paint served another purpose: concealment. The stone underneath remained structurally compromised, weakened by the intense heat. The bright white exterior presented a facade of strength while hiding fundamental damage. The symbolism writes itself: a building that projects power while covering its scars with cosmetic solutions. Every subsequent renovation has discovered that the burned stone beneath the paint never fully recovered. The rebuilding took 3 years. James Monroe moved into the partially reconstructed building in 1817, but full restoration wasn't complete until 1820. And the work wasn't done by a new generation of free laborers. Enslaved people rebuilt the White House just as they'd built the original. The government rented enslaved workers again, paying their owners while the workers themselves received nothing. The same system that created the building also restored it. The British burning of Washington remains the only time a foreign power has captured and occupied the U.S. Capitol. The psychological impact was profound. The young nation's most important building reduced to a burned shell, its leaders scattered in retreat. The quick reconstruction was meant to project resilience, but the hasty nature of the work created problems that persist. The replacement timbers were green wood, not properly aged, leading to warping and structural issues within decades. What the burning proved was vulnerability. The White House could be reached, it could be entered, it could be destroyed. Every security measure implemented since, the fences, the barriers, the expanded perimeter, traces back to August 24, 1814, when enemies sat at the president's table and then burned it all down. The building that symbolizes American power was once occupied by its enemies, who ate American food before committing arson. The paint dried white, but the stone underneath never forgot. Abraham Lincoln believed he saw his own death in a mirror. It was shortly after his first election in 1860. Lincoln later described the vision to his friend Noah Brooks and his bodyguard Ward Hill Lamon. He saw a double image of himself in a mirror, one face pale and ghostly, the other normal. Mary Todd Lincoln interpreted it as a prophecy. He would serve 2 terms but wouldn't survive the second. She was half right. Lincoln's time in the White House was defined by death. Not just the Civil War casualties, though 620,000 dead certainly haunted him, but personal losses. His son Willie died in the mansion in 1862, probably from typhoid fever contracted from contaminated water in the Potomac. The boy was 11 years old. Mary Todd Lincoln never recovered. She held seances in the Red Room, trying to contact Willie's spirit, while her husband led a war that was killing thousands daily. The president's mental state deteriorated throughout his presidency. He experienced what his contemporaries called melancholy, what we would now recognize as severe depression. He wrote about suicide, about feeling the hypochondria, their term for depression, about being haunted by the mathematics of death. Every military report brought new casualty figures. He read them all. He signed the letters to widows and mothers. The White House became a psychological prison where America's worst trauma played out in real time. But the supernatural elements persist in documented accounts. White House staff reported hearing Lincoln's footsteps pacing the second-floor hallway at night, a habit confirmed by his personal secretaries. After his assassination, those footsteps continued. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote that she sensed Lincoln's presence. Winston Churchill, staying in the Lincoln bedroom during World War II, claimed he saw Lincoln's ghost emerging from the bathroom. Churchill, not a man prone to supernatural claims, allegedly said, "Good evening, Mr. President," before Lincoln's apparition vanished. These accounts are easy to dismiss until you examine the context. Churchill's sighting occurred during World War II, another period of mass death, in the same room where Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The parallelism is striking. 2 wartime leaders centuries apart, in the same space, confronting the moral weight of historical decisions. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the psychological pressure of that room's history is undeniable. Lincoln himself reported prophetic dreams. Days before his assassination, he told his cabinet about a recurring nightmare, walking through the White House and hearing sobbing. Following the sound, he entered the East Room and found the catafalque with a body laid in state, surrounded by mourners. When he asked who had died, a soldier replied, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln awoke in cold sweat. Less than a week later, he was shot at Ford's Theater. His body was brought back to the White House and placed in the East Room, exactly as he dreamed. The historical record doesn't lie, but it also doesn't explain. Lincoln told this dream to multiple witnesses before his death, including his bodyguard and his wife. The details were recorded before the assassination, not retrofitted afterward. Whether it was genuine precognition or anxiety manifesting as prophetic dreams, the coincidence remains disturbing. Lincoln predicted his own death in specific detail and then lived it exactly. The war ended in April 1865. Lincoln attended a cabinet meeting on April 14th discussing Reconstruction. That evening, he went to Ford's Theater to see Our American Cousin, a comedy. John Wilkes Booth shot him in the back of the head at 10:20 p.m. Lincoln was carried to a boarding house across the street. He was too tall to fit comfortably in the bed, so he lay diagonally. He died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th without regaining consciousness. His body returned to the White House. Mary Todd Lincoln was too distraught to plan the funeral, so others organized everything. The East Room was draped in black. The coffin was placed on the same catafalque Lincoln had seen in his dream, though whether the details perfectly matched his vision remains debated by historians. What's documented, over 25,000 people filed past his body in the White House before it was taken by train back to Illinois for burial. The psychological wait didn't end with his death. Booth was shot and killed on April 26th. Of the 8 co-conspirators, 4 were hanged, including Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the U.S. government. The hangings took place at Fort McNair in Washington, now a quiet military installation where few remember what happened there. The violence rippled outward, claiming lives in expanding circles. The White House absorbed all of this: Lincoln's depression, his son's death, Mary's seances, the assassination's aftermath. The building held space for America's worst trauma while presenting a facade of strength. Lincoln's ghost sightings, whether real or psychological projection, speak to how trauma embeds itself in physical spaces. The Lincoln bedroom remains the most requested guest room for visiting dignitaries, all sleeping where a man who predicted his murder once worked late into the night. The mirrors in that room have been replaced many times, but the story of Lincoln's vision persists, documented in his own words before his death. He saw himself doubled, one image alive and one already ghostly. Whether prophecy or paranoia, he was right. By 1948, the White House was literally collapsing under its own weight. Harry Truman's bathtub was sinking. Not metaphorically. The floor beneath the tub in the second-floor residence was sagging, causing visible cracks in the ceiling below. When engineers investigated, they discovered something terrifying. The entire building was structurally failing. The wooden beams supporting floors were rotting. The load-bearing walls were compromised. The whole structure was settling unevenly, creating cracks that ran from foundation to roof. The most important building in America was on the verge of catastrophic collapse. The problems trace back to the 1814 fire and hasty reconstruction. The replacement timbers had been greenwood, not properly aged, causing them to warp and weaken over decades. Subsequent renovations had added weight, new floors, new walls, modern amenities, without addressing the fundamental structural issues. Theodore Roosevelt's 1902 renovation added the West Wing, but didn't reinforce the original building. Each improvement made the foundation problem worse. By the 1940s, the White House was a historical facade supported by failing infrastructure. Truman commissioned a comprehensive engineering study. The results were damning. The building was unsafe for occupancy. The massive chandelier in the East Room was in danger of crashing through the floor. The ceiling in the state dining room sagged visibly. Some floors could only support their own weight. Adding furniture or people risks collapse. The report concluded that the White House needed complete gutting and reconstruction. The alternative was abandoning the building entirely and constructing a new executive mansion elsewhere. The political implications were enormous. Admitting the White House was structurally unsound meant acknowledging decades of neglect and poor maintenance. It also meant displacing the first family during a reconstruction that would take years. But Truman, characteristically blunt, made the decision. They would strip the White House to its exterior walls and rebuild everything inside from scratch. It would be the most extensive renovation in the building's history, and Truman wouldn't sugarcoat why it was necessary. The house was falling apart. In 1948, the Truman family moved across the street to Blair House. Workers began the most extreme renovation any occupied building of historical significance has ever undergone. They removed everything inside the exterior walls, every floor, every wall, every wooden beam. They excavated 2 sub-basements where none had existed before. They poured a new concrete foundation and erected a steel frame inside the historical shell. The original White House was essentially demolished from the inside, preserving only the facade. The discovered conditions were worse than anticipated. Original wooden beams were rotted through, held together by paint and plaster. Some supports had been gnawed by rats and termites. The brick walls were crumbling in places. Water damage was extensive. Decades of leaks had compromised the masonry. Workers found artifacts from previous eras, old newspapers used as insulation, tools left by earlier craftsmen, debris from the 1814 fire still embedded in the stone. They also found human remains, workers who died during original construction, buried in the foundation or walls, their presence never officially recorded. The renovation cost $5.7 million, about $75 million today. It took 4 years. The Trumans lived in Blair House the entire time, the longest any sitting president has lived outside the White House. During this period, Puerto Rican nationalists attempted to assassinate Truman at Blair House, killing a police officer and wounding others in a gunfight on the front steps. The assassination attempt happened because Truman was displaced from the White House, a direct consequence of the structural failure. When the renovation was complete in 1952, the building looked identical from the outside, but was completely new inside. The original wooden floors were saved and reinstalled, but now they rested on steel beams and concrete, not failing timber. The exterior walls were reinforced from the inside. Modern amenities, air conditioning, updated electrical and plumbing were integrated throughout. The White House had been transformed from a 150-year-old structure on the verge of collapse into a modern building disguised as a historical one. But the renovation also erased history. The original interior, with all its imperfections and historical layers, was destroyed. Purists argued that the real White House no longer existed. What stood after 1952 was a replica, a movie set with historical walls but no authentic interior. Defenders countered that preservation without structural integrity was pointless. The building had to function as a residence and workspace, not just a museum. The debate over authenticity versus functionality continues among preservationists. The steel frame installed in 1952 fundamentally changed the building's nature. The White House is no longer a historical structure that's been maintained. It's a modern building wearing a historical costume. The limestone exterior walls don't bear the weight of the building anymore. The steel frame does. The walls are essentially decorative now, held in place by the internal structure. The building is an architectural lie, presenting historical continuity while having been completely reconstructed. Truman never lived in the renovated White House. His term ended in January 1953, and Eisenhower was the first president to occupy the rebuilt mansion. Truman later said making the decision to renovate was one of his hardest calls as president, but the alternative was watching the building collapse or abandoning it entirely. The engineering reports left no room for debate. The White House as it existed in 1948 could not continue to exist. It had to be destroyed to be saved. The bathtub that started the discovery still exists, reinstalled in roughly the same location, but now supported by steel beams and concrete instead of failing timber. The floors don't sag, the chandeliers hang securely. The building functions perfectly because underneath the historical facade, it's only 70 years old.
Consider these verified figures. The original White House construction cost $232,372 in 1792, approximately $7.2 million today. A minimum of 650 enslaved people worked on the construction, though the actual number was likely higher. Records were deliberately incomplete. The 1814 fire destroyed approximately 95% of the interior, with restoration costs of $317,000. The 1948 to 1952 Truman renovation required removing 660 tons of steel beams and installing 660 tons of new steel framing. During that renovation, workers removed and cataloged 29,700 items, including 950 doors. The building has been expanded from 55,000 square feet of living space, plus an additional 70,000 square feet of workspace. The original footprint now represents less than half the total White House complex. By 2025, the estimated replacement value exceeds $397 million, not counting historical value, which remains incalculable.
Every president elected in a year ending in 0, from 1840 to 1960, died in office. The pattern is documented. William Henry Harrison, 1840, Abraham Lincoln, 1860, James Garfield, 1880, William McKinley, 1900, Warren Harding, 1920, Franklin Roosevelt, 1940, and John F. Kennedy, 1960. 7 presidents elected at 20-year intervals all died while serving. 4 were assassinated. The statistical probability of this occurring by random chance is roughly 1 in 400,000. Something about the White House seemed fatal to anyone elected in these specific years. The curse derives from Shawnee leader Tecumseh, who fought against American expansion in the early 1800s. After William Henry Harrison defeated Tecumseh's Confederation at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, legend claims Tecumseh's brother Tenskwatawa, a prophet, cursed the American presidency. The curse: every great white father elected in a year divisible by 20 would die in office. When Harrison himself was elected in 1940 and died 30 days later from pneumonia, the curse entered American folklore. But the historical record complicates the narrative. There's no contemporary documentation of Tenskwatawa making such a curse. The legend appeared in print only in the 1930s, retroactively applied to the pattern after several presidents had already died. It might be entirely invented, a coincidence given meaning through hindsight. Yet the pattern continued with eerie precision for 120 years, long after anyone would have remembered an obscure 1811 curse if it ever existed at all. Each death had its own explanation. Harrison's pneumonia came from delivering a 2-hour inaugural address in cold rain without a coat, refusing to show weakness at age 68. Lincoln was shot by Booth, a consequence of Civil War hatreds. Garfield was shot by Charles Guiteau, a disappointed office seeker. Garfield actually died from his doctor's unsanitary treatment, not the bullet. McKinley was shot by anarchist Leon Charles Goth. Harding had a heart attack, though conspiracy theories about poisoning persist. FDR died from a cerebral hemorrhage after 12 years in office during Depression and World War. Kennedy was shot in Dallas under circumstances still debated. None of these deaths required supernatural explanation. They had clear causes: disease, assassination, medical malpractice, cardiovascular failure. Yet the 20-year pattern remained unbroken across more than a century. Historians note that the presidency is inherently dangerous. The stress is enormous. Assassination attempts have been frequent, and medical care for much of American history was primitive. The curse might simply be a mnemonic device for remembering a statistically unlikely but ultimately explicable pattern. Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980, was shot by John Hinckley Jr. on March 30, 1981. The bullet punctured his lung, missing his heart by inches. He nearly died. His blood pressure dropped critically and he went into emergency surgery. But Reagan survived, recovering fully. The curse, if it ever existed, was broken. He served 2 full terms and lived to age 93. Or was it broken earlier? The curse specified presidents elected in these years would die in office. Harrison, Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, Harding, and Kennedy all died during their terms. But FDR was elected in 1940 to his 3rd term. Did the curse target his election year or his first election in 1932? If the latter, he doesn't fit the pattern. This ambiguity reveals how curses work. They're flexible enough to accommodate contradictory evidence, unfalsifiable enough to persist despite counterexamples. The White House itself bore witness to 3 of these deaths. Harrison died there in 1841, in the bedroom. Harding died suddenly in 1923 while returning from Alaska, his body brought back to the White House. FDR died in Warm Springs, Georgia, but his funeral was held in the White House East Room. The building held the weight of these deaths, absorbed them into its history, became associated with presidential mortality itself. The psychological impact on subsequent presidents was real. Reagan's staff was aware of the pattern, and his survival was seen as breaking it. George W. Bush, elected in 2000, publicly dismissed the curse, but increased security protocols exceeded any prior administration. Barack Obama, elected in 2008, didn't fit the pattern, not a 0 year, but faced more death threats than any president in history. Joe Biden, elected in 2020, at 78, became the oldest president inaugurated. The curse suddenly felt relevant again to conspiracy theorists online. But here's the rational analysis. The curse worked because being president has always been dangerous. Early presidents had minimal security. Assassinations were attempted regularly. Medical care was poor. The job is phenomenally stressful. Life expectancy for presidents has historically been lower than equivalent demographics. Curse were not. The 20-year pattern is dramatic but coincidental. 7 data points over 120 years, with clear proximate causes for each death. Yet the pattern persisted with uncanny precision from 1840 to 1960. That's 6 perfect iterations of the supposed curse. The probability of such a pattern existing randomly remains astronomically low. Either it's the longest-running coincidence in American history, or some combination of factors, stress, danger, historical period, medical limitations, created a genuine pattern that only broke when modern medicine and security finally made the presidency survivable. The curse, if believed, implies the White House itself is cursed space, that every president who wins in certain years is doomed by the building they're elected to occupy. This is superstitious thinking, obviously, but superstitious thinking about patterns that did factually occur. 7 presidents elected in 20-year cycles did die in office. Ronald Reagan was shot and nearly died. The pattern existed. The question is only whether it had supernatural causes or natural ones. The numbers don't lie. The interpretation does. Tenskwatawa, whether he made the curse or not, died in 1836 in Kansas, forgotten and impoverished. His brother, Tecumseh, was killed in battle in 1813, fighting alongside British forces against Americans. Their confederation was destroyed, their people displaced, their culture suppressed. If Tenskwatawa did curse the presidency, it was an act of desperation from a defeated people watching their world end. And for 120 years, something killed presidents on schedule. The White House still stands. The curse, if it existed, is gone. But the building remembers. Every president who enters knows the history. 7 of their predecessors died in that house or because of that office. Curse or coincidence, the White House has always been a dangerous place to live.
There's a bunker under the White House that the public has never seen. The Presidential Emergency Operations Center, call it the PEOC, was constructed in secret during World War II, upgraded during the Cold War, and reinforced after 9/11. Its exact location, depth, and capabilities remain classified. What's known, it's a hardened bunker designed to withstand nuclear attack, equipped with life support systems, communications infrastructure, and enough supplies to shelter the president and essential staff for extended periods. It exists beneath the East Wing, accessible through multiple secure tunnels, including one that runs under the Treasury Building. The bunker's existence only became public knowledge in 2001, when Vice President Dick Cheney was photographed being rushed there during the 9/11 attacks. Before that, its existence was classified, mentioned in classified documents, but never officially acknowledged. Even now, photographs of the interior are prohibited. Detailed specifications remain secret, and its full capabilities are known only to those with appropriate clearances. The president lives atop a fortress that most Americans will never see. Construction began in 1942, during World War II, when Washington feared German or Japanese air raids.
The original bunker was relatively modest, reinforced rooms with basic communications equipment, designed more as a bomb shelter than a command center. But during the Cold War, as nuclear weapons proliferated, the facility was massively expanded. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 revealed how inadequate the existing bunker was. Kennedy had access to a shelter, but not a proper command center from which to manage nuclear war. Subsequent renovations, particularly during the Reagan administration, transformed the PEOC into a sophisticated facility. The exact depth is classified, but analysis of construction timelines and declassified documents suggests it's at least 3 stories underground, possibly more. The bunker is reportedly connected to an underground tunnel network that links to other secure facilities in Washington, including Mount Weather in Virginia, the primary relocation site for government continuity operations. The PEOC is staffed 24/7 by military and intelligence personnel. It includes secure communications equipment capable of maintaining contact with nuclear submarines, military commanders worldwide, and other national security facilities. It has independent power generation, air filtration capable of handling chemical and biological threats, and water supplies. It's designed to function as a sealed environment for days or weeks if necessary. During national emergencies, key cabinet members and military leadership assemble there. But the psychological implications are darker. The existence of the bunker means every president lives knowing that their home is also a target significant enough to require a nuclear-hardened shelter. It means accepting that their family residence sits atop a facility designed for scenarios involving millions of casualties. The White House isn't just a house, it's ground zero for any attack on American leadership. The bunker's existence acknowledges this reality. The Secret Service controls access absolutely. Only personnel with appropriate clearances can enter. Even White House staff with general access aren't allowed in the PEOC without specific authorization. The security protocols are extreme. Multiple checkpoints, biometric scanners, armed guards. The message is clear. This space is separate from the White House proper, governed by different rules, accessible only to those managing existential threats. During 9/11, Cheney spent hours in the PEOC, coordinating response efforts while the White House evacuation was underway. According to later accounts, the atmosphere was chaotic, contradictory reports coming in, confusion about additional attacks, fears that Washington itself was under sustained assault. The bunker provided physical protection, but psychological isolation. Cheney was safe, but cut off, making decisions based on incomplete information while the world burned above. The 9/11 renovations expanded the facility significantly. The exact budget is classified, but estimates suggest hundreds of millions were spent enhancing the bunker's capabilities. Modern digital infrastructure was installed, surveillance systems upgraded, and physical protections reinforced against more sophisticated threats. The facility evolved from a Cold War nuclear shelter into a modern command center capable of handling cyber warfare, terrorism, and hybrid threats. What disturbs historians is the secrecy. Unlike other presidential facilities, Camp David, Air Force One, the PEOC remains largely classified. The public knows it exists, but not what it contains, how deep it goes, or what exactly happens there. It creates a parallel White House, a shadow structure beneath the official residence where decisions can be made away from public view during crises. It's necessary for security, but troubling for transparency. Consider the implications. The president can disappear into a bunker and continue governing while remaining physically hidden. During extreme emergencies, the visible White House becomes irrelevant. The actual presidency moves underground. The building above is the symbol. The bunker below is the reality. Americans pledge allegiance to the former while never seeing the latter. There are contingency plans, classified documents detailing scenarios where the president must evacuate to the PEOC or beyond. These plans account for nuclear attack, biological warfare, invasion, and civil breakdown. They specify who goes into the bunker, who stays behind, and how governmental continuity is maintained.
The president receives regular briefings on these scenarios. They practice evacuations. They tour the facility when they take office, seeing the place where they might spend their final hours. The PEOC exists because the White House is a target. Every foreign adversary knows its location, has mapped its structure, and has likely designated it for destruction in their war plans. The building's historical significance makes it symbolic, but also vulnerable. The bunker acknowledges that during a real attack, the White House above would be destroyed. The goal is merely to keep the president alive long enough to respond. And there's something psychologically destabilizing about living atop your own bunker. Every president sleeps knowing that beneath them is a facility designed for scenarios where civilization collapses. It's a constant reminder of catastrophic possibilities, literally built into their home. The White House isn't just where the president lives, it's where they might die and where they try to survive if everything else failed. The public sees the portico, the rose garden, the press briefings. What they don't see is the hardened door, the tunnel entrance, the descent into classified space where the real decisions get made when everything goes wrong. The White House has two faces, the public symbol and the secret fortress. You can tour the former. The latter remains hidden, operational, waiting for the crisis that would make it necessary. The bunker doesn't make the president safer, really. It just gives them somewhere to go when safety is no longer possible.
For decades, the American public had no idea their presidents were dying in office. Woodrow Wilson had a massive stroke in October 1919 that left him partially paralyzed and cognitively impaired for the remaining year and a half of his presidency. The public wasn't told. His wife Edith and his doctor effectively ran the executive branch while maintaining the fiction that Wilson was recovering and still making decisions. Cabinet members were denied access to him. Important documents were supposedly reviewed by the president, but it was actually Edith deciding which items he'd see and interpreting his limited responses. The United States had no functional president for 18 months, and the deception remained successful. Wilson's stroke occurred in the middle of the fight over the Treaty of Versailles and a League of Nations. Whether America would join the League, Wilson's signature post-WWI initiative, was being decided while he was incapacitated. He couldn't attend meetings, couldn't engage in negotiations, couldn't fulfill the most basic duties of his office. Yet the White House maintained that he was recovering and would return to full capacity shortly. The reality was that he never recovered. He left office in March 1921 still disabled, dying 3 years later having never regained his previous function. But Wilson wasn't an exception. He was part of a pattern of medical deception that defined the White House for much of the 20th century. Franklin Roosevelt's polio was hidden from the public through careful photo management. He couldn't walk unassisted, yet most Americans believed he could, because photographs showed him standing, always with concealed support, his paralysis cropped out of frame or hidden behind lecterns. The press cooperated in the deception. There was an informal agreement not to photograph Roosevelt in his wheelchair. FDR's cardiovascular decline in his final years was also concealed. By 1944, he had severe hypertension and heart disease. His doctors knew his life expectancy was limited, yet he ran for a fourth term, winning while medically unfit for office. He died in April 1945, just months into that term. Had voters known his true condition, the 1944 election might have had a different outcome. Instead, Harry Truman, who'd been vice president for only 82 days, suddenly became president at the climax of World War II, uninformed about the Manhattan Project or major diplomatic agreements Roosevelt had made. John F. Kennedy's health problems were extensive and carefully hidden. He had Addison's disease, chronic back pain requiring regular pain medication, and various other conditions that required daily drug protocols. His doctor, Max Jacobson, known as Dr. Feelgood, administered amphetamines and other substances regularly. Kennedy was taking painkillers, steroids, hormones, and stimulants throughout his presidency. His public image was vigor and youth. The reality was a man in constant pain managing multiple conditions through aggressive pharmaceutical intervention. The medical deception served political purposes. Admitting presidential disability would trigger questions about succession, about competency, about who's actually making decisions. It would expose vulnerabilities to foreign adversaries. It would potentially invalidate decisions made during periods of incapacity. So the default became lie, maintain the fiction of presidential health regardless of reality. The White House Medical Unit existed not primarily to treat the president, but to manage information about the president's condition. Reagan's cognitive decline during his second term remains controversial. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in 1994, 5 years after leaving office. But when did the decline begin? Former aides have suggested he showed early symptoms during his presidency: confusion, memory lapses, moments of disorientation. If true, the public was never informed. Reagan's sunny disposition and scripted public appearances concealed whatever was happening cognitively. The full truth remains disputed and likely will never be fully known. The 25th Amendment, ratified in 1967, was supposed to address presidential disability. It established procedures for temporarily transferring power if the president was incapacitated. Yet it's been invoked only for planned medical procedures: Reagan's colon surgery, George W. Bush's colonoscopies. It has never been used for the scenario it was designed for: a president too impaired to perform duties but unwilling or unable to admit it. The Wilson situation, a president incapacitated while aides run the government, remains possible even after the 25th Amendment. Why the persistent deception? Partly it's about power. Admitting weakness invites challenges, domestically and internationally. Partly it's about the myth of presidential strength. Americans want to believe their president is robust, healthy, commanding. The reality that presidents are human, subject to disease and decline, contradicts the symbolic role they serve. So the medical truth gets hidden, managed, spun until it becomes unavoidable. The White House Medical Unit operates with unusual privacy. Unlike other government medical services, its operations aren't subject to standard oversight. The president's medical records are private. The White House physician serves at the president's pleasure and can be dismissed for disclosing unwelcome truths. This creates a structural incentive toward concealment. The doctor who honestly reports presidential impairment might find themselves unemployed, while the doctor who maintains helpful fictions keeps their position. Modern media makes total concealment harder, but not impossible. Roosevelt couldn't hide his wheelchair in the smartphone age. There'd be video. But cognitive decline, medication dependence, those can still be managed through careful scheduling, limited press access, and controlled messaging. The president appears in public only when prepared, briefed, medicated as needed. Unscripted moments are minimized. The image remains controlled. Consider the ethical problem. If the president is medically unfit, who decides what the public should know? The president themselves, who has incentive to conceal? The doctor who serves the president? The cabinet, which might benefit from a weak president? The press, which might be accused of invasiveness? There's no neutral arbiter, no system that reliably produces honest disclosure. The structural incentives all favor concealment until concealment becomes impossible. The White House has seen presidents who were drunk, reportedly several, presidents who were cognitively impaired, Wilson, possibly Reagan, presidents who were physically disabled, FDR, and presidents who were managing serious illnesses while in office, Eisenhower's heart attack. In most cases, the full truth emerged only decades later through memoirs and declassified documents. The contemporary public was simply lied to, consistently, across administrations. This matters because presidential disability affects real decisions. Wilson's stroke coincided with critical Treaty of Versailles negotiations. FDR's decline occurred during war planning. Kennedy's pain and medication were factors during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was managing nuclear brinksmanship while on amphetamines and pain medication. These weren't trivial moments when presidential impairment was inconsequential. They were hinge points in history where the president's actual capacity directly affected outcomes. The pattern continues because it works. Medical deception has been successful for over a century. Presidents have hidden disabilities, finished their terms, and the system continued functioning. The rare occasions when disability became public, Eisenhower's heart attack, Reagan's shooting, the presidents recovered and the moment passed. The lesson learned was that concealment is possible and politically advantageous, so it persists. The White House is where America's most powerful person lives and works. It's also where human frailty and political necessity collide, producing a sustained pattern of medical deception. The building itself becomes complicit. Its walls conceal the truth. Its controlled access prevents unwanted observation. Its medical facilities operate in secrecy. The public sees the healthy president at the podium. What happens behind closed doors remains carefully hidden. There have been over 20 documented attempts to kill sitting presidents, most of which the public never learned about. The successful assassinations, Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, Kennedy, are taught in schools, but the attempts that failed? Andrew Jackson was shot at by Richard Lawrence in 1835. Both pistols misfired in a probability calculated at 1 in 125,000. Theodore Roosevelt was shot before a speech in 1912 and continued speaking with a bullet in his chest for 90 minutes. Franklin Roosevelt was shot at in Miami in 1933, 3 weeks before inauguration. The bullet killed Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak instead. Harry Truman survived an assault on Blair House in 1950. White House police officer Leslie Caufelt died defending him. Gerald Ford survived 2 assassination attempts in September 1975, 17 days apart. Then there are the attempts that never became public. The Secret Service reports threats constantly, hundreds per year requiring investigation, dozens per year considered credible. Most are stopped in the planning phase. Some reach closer proximity than the public knows. The classification of security incidents means many assassination attempts remain secret even decades later. The full history of presidential assassination attempts is still partly classified. Consider the math. Approximately 1 in 6 presidents has been assassinated, and roughly 1 in 4 has survived a serious attempt. That makes being president one of the most dangerous elected positions in the world. The White House isn't just historically significant, it's operationally a combat zone where a significant percentage of occupants have been fired upon. The Andrew Jackson attempt was bizarre even at the time. Richard Lawrence believed he was King Richard III of England and that Jackson had killed his father. He approached Jackson after a funeral at the Capitol, drew 2 pistols, and fired both at point-blank range. Both misfired. The percussion caps detonated, but the gunpowder didn't ignite. Jackson, 67 years old, attacked Lawrence with his cane. The crowd subdued Lawrence, who was judged insane and institutionalized for life. Later testing of the pistols showed they worked perfectly, firing every subsequent time. The probability of 2 misfires was so low that conspiracy theories immediately emerged, never definitively resolved. Theodore Roosevelt's 1912 attempt occurred before he could move back into the White House. He was running for a 3rd term against Taft and Wilson. John Schrank shot him outside a hotel in Milwaukee. The bullet hit Roosevelt's chest, but was slowed by his steel eyeglass case and the folded 50-page speech in his coat pocket. Roosevelt assessed his wound, determined he wasn't coughing blood, suggesting no lung puncture, and insisted on delivering his scheduled speech before seeking medical attention. He began, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot." He spoke for 90 minutes with a bullet lodged in his chest. Doctors later decided removing it was more dangerous than leaving it, so Roosevelt carried the bullet for the rest of his life. The attempt on FDR in Miami is often forgotten. It occurred before his presidency technically began. Giuseppe Zangara fired 5 shots at Roosevelt's car in Bayfront Park. FDR was unharmed, but Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak was killed, along with injuries to 4 others. Zangara claimed he hated rich and powerful people, targeting Roosevelt for symbolic reasons. He was convicted and executed in the electric chair within weeks. Conspiracy theories suggest Zangara was actually targeting Cermak, who had connections to organized crime, and FDR was the cover story, but evidence is circumstantial at best. The 1950 attempt on Truman at Blair House was a firefight. Oscar Collazo and Griselio Torresola, Puerto Rican nationalists seeking independence, attacked the building in daylight breakout. Torresola killed White House police officer Leslie Koffelt and wounded 2 others. Koffelt, dying, shot Torresola dead. Collazo was wounded and captured. Truman was upstairs napping. He came to the window to see what the commotion was, exposing himself to potential gunfire before being pulled back. The attack lasted less than a minute, but left 2 dead and 3 wounded. Collazo was sentenced to death, but Truman commuted it to life imprisonment. Jimmy Carter later commuted it to time served, and Collazo was released in 1979. Gerald Ford survived 2 attempts in September 1975, both in California. On September 5th, Lynette Squeaky Fromm, a Manson family member, pointed a gun at Ford in Sacramento. The gun had 4 rounds, but none in the chamber. Secret Service tackled her before she could chamber a round. On September 22nd, Sarah Jane Moore fired 1 shot at Ford in San Francisco, missing as a bystander grabbed her arm. She was subdued and arrested. Both women are still alive. Fromm was released from prison in 2009, Moore in 2007. Ford lived to 93, dying peacefully in 2006. Reagan's 1981 shooting is well documented. John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 shots in 3.4 seconds outside the Washington Hilton. One hit press secretary James Brady in the head, permanently disabling him. One hit police officer Thomas Delahanty. One hit Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy in the abdomen. One hit Reagan, the bullet ricocheting off the presidential limousine before entering under his left arm. Reagan initially didn't realize he'd been shot. He thought a Secret Service agent had broken his rib during the protective tackle. Only when he coughed blood in the limousine did they realize. He walked into George Washington University Hospital, but collapsed inside, having lost massive blood. Emergency surgery saved his life. Hinckley was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was institutionalized for life. But those are the famous attempts. The Secret Service maintains classified records of other incidents that never became public. During the Cold War, Soviet intelligence reportedly considered assassination as part of destabilization strategy. Documents released after the SSR's collapse reference planning, though whether specific attempts were made remains disputed. Domestic threats are constant. The Secret Service investigates hundreds of credible threats annually. Most stopped before they develop into attempts. Post 9/11, threat assessments expanded. The White House became a potential target for aircraft, biological weapons, and cyber attacks beyond traditional assassination methods. Air defense systems around Washington became more sophisticated. The no-fly zone tightened. Security perimeters expanded. The presumption became that attacks would come eventually, and the goal was detection and prevention rather than assuming safety. The psychological impact on presidents varies. Some become fatalistic. If someone's determined enough, security can't prevent everything. Some become paranoid, restricting movement, trusting fewer people, seeing threats everywhere. Reagan joked to doctors, "I hope you're all Republicans," before surgery after being shot. Kennedy remarked before Dallas that if someone wanted to kill him from a window, there was nothing that could be done. These responses reflect acceptance that the job includes mortal danger. The White House itself has been attacked directly multiple times. In 1994, Francisco Martin Duran fired 29 rounds from an SKS rifle at the building from Pennsylvania Avenue, aiming at people on the lawn. In 2011, Oscar Ramiro Ortega Hernandez fired shots at the building, with at least 7 bullets striking it. Both attackers were captured and imprisoned. The building itself, the symbol, becomes the target even when the president isn't present. Attacking the White House itself is a statement, an assault on American power, regardless of it achieving the goal of killing the president. Security has improved, but perfect security is impossible. A determined attacker with insider knowledge or willingness to die can always pose a threat. The Secret Service knows this. Every president knows this. The job requires accepting that assassination is possible, even likely to be attempted, and continuing anyway. The White House is where this calculation gets made daily. Stay and risk death, or abandon the position that makes you a target. 20 attempts, 4 successful. Dozens more stopped in planning. The White House has seen more violence than any battlefield of equivalent size. It's a target that's been attacked for over 2 centuries, and the attacks continue. Every president who lives there knows they're statistically more likely to be shot at than to serve without incident. The building that represents American democracy is also one of the most dangerous addresses in the world. The question isn't whether the White House is a target, it demonstrably is. The question is whether it's worth living in a place where so many predecessors have been attacked, wounded, or killed. Every president so far has answered yes. The alternative, showing fear, relocating, abandoning the symbol, would be its own form of defeat. So they stay, and the threats continue, and the building absorbs it all. Another attempted assassination to add to its history.
Consider these documented figures. 24 serious assassination attempts or plots against sitting presidents have been documented, with 4 successful assassinations representing a 17% success rate. The Secret Service investigates approximately 4,000 threats annually, of which roughly 400 are classified as credible enough to warrant active investigation. The White House has been directly fired upon at least 7 times, with bullets striking the building in documented incidents in 1994 and 2011. Security costs for the White House complex exceed $2 billion annually when including personnel, technology, and infrastructure. The fence surrounding the complex has been breached 18 times since 2014, leading to its replacement with a taller 13-foot barrier in 2019. The President's protective detail consists of approximately 3,200 Secret Service agents and officers, with roughly 1,300 assigned directly to White House security at any given time. There are tunnels under Washington, D.C. connecting the White House to bunkers, agencies, and escape routes the public has never seen. The official tunnel network is acknowledged but not mapped for public access. Connections to the Treasury Department, the old Executive Office Building, and the Capitol Building. These allow secured movement without surface exposure. But declassified documents and construction records suggest a much more extensive system, tunnels reaching to the Pentagon, to secure facilities in Virginia, to evacuation points outside the city. The full network is classified, its extent known only to those with appropriate clearances. Construction began during World War II, accelerated during the Cold War, and has continued through every subsequent administration. Modern tunneling technology allows for construction with minimal surface disruption. You can build significant underground infrastructure without nearby residents knowing. The Washington Metro system, built in the 1970s-90s, provided cover for expanding secure tunnel networks. Some construction attributed to Metro actually supported classified projects. The tunnels serve multiple purposes. Evacuation routes allow the president to leave the White House without being visible to surveillance. Secure communication lines run through them, protected from electronic eavesdropping and physical attack. They connect to infrastructure required for government continuity, backup power stations, water supplies, communication nodes. During national emergencies, key personnel can move throughout Washington without surface exposure. But the existence of such a network means Washington has 2 cities, the visible one above ground and the classified one below. Decisions can be made, people can move, operations can occur entirely underground. During extreme emergencies, the functional government relocates below, while the surface city becomes irrelevant or even abandoned. The tunnels represent a parallel infrastructure designed for scenarios where normal operations are impossible. The scope is genuinely unclear. The classified documents reference Site R, Raven Rock, Pennsylvania, and Mount Weather, Virginia, as relocation facilities connected to Washington. The distances involved, over 60 miles, suggest either very long tunnels or, more likely, intermediate stations where transport switches from tunnel to secure surface vehicles. The exact logistics remain classified, but the system is designed to evacuate the president and essential staff quickly, even if surface routes are compromised.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, evacuation plans were activated. Key personnel were briefed on tunnel routes and evacuation procedures. The system was tested to ensure it would function if nuclear war became imminent. Ultimately, the crisis resolved without evacuation, but the plans revealed how seriously the underground network was taken. It wasn't theoretical backup, but operational infrastructure maintained for immediate use. The post-9/11 expansions upgraded the network significantly. Fiber optic communication lines, modern surveillance systems, and structural reinforcements against more sophisticated attacks. The goal shifted from purely nuclear defense to handling a wider range of threats: chemical, biological, cyber attacks on infrastructure. The tunnels evolved from bomb shelters to comprehensive secure facilities capable of supporting extended operations. What disturbs researchers is the lack of oversight. Tunnel construction and maintenance fall under classified security operations, exempt from normal environmental review or public comment. Congress is briefed on broad concepts, but not specific details. Local governments aren't informed when construction occurs under their jurisdiction. The underground network expands according to executive security priorities, accountable only to those who use it. There are also unmapped areas, unofficial tunnels from earlier eras that may or may not still be accessible. Washington's history includes bootlegging during Prohibition, Civil War-era construction, and various clandestine projects whose records have been lost or destroyed. Some of these old tunnels intersect with newer construction. Maintenance workers occasionally discover spaces that aren't on current maps, suggesting the underground network is more extensive and chaotic than official documentation indicates. Urban explorers and researchers have attempted to map the tunnels through indirect methods, tracking construction permits, monitoring utility work, comparing historical maps with modern infrastructure. These efforts produce speculative maps suggesting networks far more extensive than officially acknowledged. Whether accurate or not, they indicate that the public perception is of a vast underground city beneath Washington, most of which remains classified or forgotten. The tunnels also represent continuity of government in its most literal form, physical infrastructure ensuring the government can continue functioning regardless of surface conditions. If Washington were attacked, bombed, or rendered uninhabitable, the underground network would allow essential operations to continue. This is both reassuring, the government has backup plans, and disturbing. The backup plans assume scenarios where the capital city is destroyed. Security is absolute. Access requires multiple clearances and biometric verification. The tunnels are monitored by cameras and sensors, with armed guards at checkpoints. Even maintenance workers operate under escort and strict protocols. The message is clear. These aren't public spaces or even normal government facilities. They're secured infrastructure where unauthorized access is treated as a security threat. But tunnels also create vulnerability. They're confined spaces with limited exits. They concentrate key personnel in predictable locations. An adversary with knowledge of the tunnel network could potentially target it specifically. The tunnels that provide security also create a single infrastructure that, if compromised, would undermine the entire continuity system. This paradox means the tunnel's existence must be balanced against the risk that their existence creates. The psychological effect on those who use them is notable. Descending into tunnels, walking through secured passages, knowing you're in classified space beneath a functioning city, it reinforces the dual nature of government. There's the visible democracy above ground and the security apparatus below. Both are real, both are necessary, but they exist in different worlds, governed by different rules. Some tunnels are designed for extreme scenarios that hopefully never occur. There are reportedly sealed sections that would only be open during nuclear war, spaces equipped for long-term habitation, with food, water, air filtration, and radiation protection. These areas represent the worst-case scenario, a government reduced to survivors and bunkers, trying to maintain continuity while the surface world ends. The tunnels connect to more than just government buildings. Hospitals, communication centers, military installations, all part of an integrated network designed to keep critical functions operating. If the president needs emergency medical care during a crisis, they can reach a hospital through secure tunnels. If communication with military commanders is required, secure lines run underground to protected facilities. The network is comprehensive, designed for total crisis management. What the tunnels ultimately represent is acceptance. Acceptance that Washington is a target. Acceptance that surface infrastructure might be destroyed. Acceptance that worst-case scenarios require expensive, permanent infrastructure to survive. The tunnels beneath the White House aren't temporary measures. They're permanent features, maintained and upgraded continuously, always ready for the emergency that might come. Every president is briefed on the tunnels shortly after taking office. They walk through some portions, learning evacuation routes and procedures. They see the infrastructure that would sustain them if everything went wrong. The experience is reportedly sobering, seeing the physical embodiment of catastrophic scenarios, knowing that these aren't theoretical spaces where they might spend their final hours. The tunnels will outlast the buildings above them. Concrete and steel underground survive longer than surface structures. Centuries from now, if the White House itself were gone, the tunnels might remain, sealed, forgotten, but physically intact. Future archaeologists might discover them and wonder what kind of society builds such elaborate underground infrastructure. The answer? A society that assumes it will be attacked and wants to survive. Washington's underground network is the infrastructure of paranoia, built and maintained at enormous cost against threats that may never materialize. But the threats have materialized before: attacks on the White House, wars, assassinations. The tunnels exist because history suggests they'll eventually be needed. Whether that's wisdom or paranoia depends on whether you believe the next attack is coming.
The White House was built by enslaved people who were never paid and whose names were deliberately erased from history. The historical record is clear. From 1792 to 1800, enslaved people from Maryland and Virginia provided much of the labor for the White House's construction. They quarried and cut the sandstone. They fired the bricks in kilns. They dug the foundations. They laid the stone walls that still stand today. And they were compensated $0. Their owners were paid $5 per month per person, but the actual laborers received nothing except the continued bondage they were already enduring. The records are specific. Payroll documents list payments to slave owners for Negro hire. The commissioners overseeing construction kept meticulous financial records, and those records distinguished between payments to white craftsmen by name with negotiated rates, and payments to slave owners by number of enslaved people rented. The enslaved individuals themselves weren't named in most records. They appeared as quantities, like tools or materials. 12 Negroes at the quarry, 8 Negroes at the kiln, dehumanized in documentation as they were dehumanized in life. Some names do appear in records: Peter, Ben, Daniel, and others, listed in payment documents to their owners. These fragmentary names are all that survived. No records exist of their ages, families, what happened to them after the White House was completed, or where they were buried when they died. The building's construction killed workers. Accidents were common, working conditions were brutal, but no death records for enslaved workers were maintained. They died anonymously, their deaths not worth recording. The White House Historical Association has acknowledged this history officially only since the 1990s. Before then, it was known to historians, but omitted from official narratives and tours. The story told was of James Hoban's architectural vision and skilled craftsmen building a neoclassical masterpiece. The enslaved labor was simply not mentioned, a systematic erasure that lasted 2 centuries. When the association finally acknowledged it, they framed it as unfortunate but typical for the time, a contextualization that emphasizes historical norms rather than moral clarity. But there's nothing typical about building the symbolic center of a democracy with slave labor. The contradiction is fundamental.
a building representing freedom and self-governance, constructed by people who had neither. The founders were aware of this irony. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, all slave owners themselves, commented on the contradiction between slavery and American ideals. Yet they perpetuated the system anyway, including in the construction of the very building that would symbolize those contradicted ideals. The enslaved workers weren't just laborers, they were skilled craftsmen. Brickmaking, stone cutting, and carpentry required expertise that enslaved people possessed because they'd been trained in those trades. The myth of unskilled slave labor is historically inaccurate. Much of America's infrastructure was built by enslaved skilled workers whose expertise was exploited without compensation. The White House's construction quality reflects this. The craftsmanship is excellent, created by people whose abilities were utilized while their humanity was denied. After the 1814 fire, when the White House was rebuilt, enslaved labor was used again. The same system, renting enslaved people from their owners, paying the owners, not the workers, reconstructed the building. The White House was built twice with slave labor, yet this fact remained largely unacknowledged in official histories until the late 20th century. 2 centuries of tours never mentioned it. Textbooks omitted it. The official narrative simply erased the people who built the building. Modern archaeological efforts have attempted to recover this history. Excavations on the White House grounds have uncovered artifacts from the construction period, including tools and personal items likely belonging to enslaved workers. But human remains haven't been found. If enslaved workers who died during construction were buried on site, the graves haven't been located or destroyed by subsequent construction. Even in death, they remain anonymous. The White House's association with slavery didn't end with its construction. The building itself housed enslaved people throughout the early 19th century. Presidents who were slave owners brought enslaved servants to work in the White House, cooking, cleaning, serving, maintaining the residence. These individuals lived and worked in the building while remaining in bondage, serving presidents who spoke publicly about liberty while privately denying it. The most extensive documentation concerns Paul Jennings, enslaved by President Madison. Jennings worked in the White House and later wrote a memoir, a rare first-person account from an enslaved person in presidential service. He described his work, the Madison administration, and eventually his path to freedom. He was purchased and freed by Senator Daniel Webster years after Madison's death. Jennings' account provides details otherwise absent from official records, what it was like to be enslaved in the White House, serving a president who owned you, working in a building constructed by people in your same condition. The reckoning with this history remains incomplete. There are no memorials on the White House grounds acknowledging the enslaved workers who built it, no permanent exhibition inside the building documenting their contributions. The White House Historical Association mentions it in their materials, but it's not central to the official narrative. Visitors on standard tours might not hear about it at all, depending on the guide. In 2016, First Lady Michelle Obama gave a speech at the Democratic National Convention addressing this directly. "I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves." The statement was politically charged and historically accurate. It forced a national conversation about the White House's origins that had been deferred for generations. Conservatives accused her of being divisive. Historians pointed out she was stating documented facts. The controversy revealed how uncomfortable Americans remain with this aspect of their history. The question becomes, how should this history be memorialized? Some argue for a prominent memorial on the grounds, a monument to the enslaved workers acknowledging their contribution. Others suggest integrating it more thoroughly into official tours and educational materials. Still others contend that no memorial can adequately address the fundamental injustice. The building shouldn't exist in its current form if it was built through slavery. The counterargument is practical. The building exists, it functions as the president's residence, and condemning it doesn't change history or help anyone. Better to acknowledge the truth, educate the public, and use the building's problematic history as a teaching moment about America's original sin. This approach accepts the contradiction, a symbol of democracy built by slave people, and uses it to illustrate the gap between American ideals and American reality. But teaching moments don't compensate for centuries of unpaid labor and systematic erasure. The enslaved people who built the White House deserved payment, deserved freedom, deserved to have their names remembered. They received none of these. Their contribution was exploited and then forgotten, deliberately excluded from the building's official history for 200 years. Acknowledging this now doesn't undo the injustice, it merely ends the additional injustice of historical erasure. The limestone blocks quarried by enslaved hands still form the White House's exterior walls. The foundation they laid still supports the building. Their labor is physically present in every stone, yet their names are absent from every plaque. The building stands as both their monument and their tombstone, a lasting testament to their skill and a permanent reminder of their exploitation. Every president since has lived in a house built by people who weren't free. This isn't metaphorical guilt, it's literal fact. The building's very structure embodies slavery. You can't separate the White House from this history. It's foundational in the most literal sense. The stones themselves are evidence. The White House's association with slavery is documented, undeniable, and central to its history. Yet it remains peripheral to its public image. The contradiction persists. America's most important building, symbolizing freedom and democracy, constructed through one of history's most profound injustices. The stones don't care about the irony, but anyone who knows the history should.
Multiple first ladies held seances in the White House trying to contact the dead, and they weren't the only ones who believed the building was haunted. Mary Todd Lincoln was the most documented. After Willie Lincoln died in 1862, she became obsessed with spiritualism, the 19th century movement claiming mediums could contact the dead. She held at least 8 seances in the White House, inviting mediums to conduct sessions in various rooms. The most famous occurred in the Red Room. Accounts describe table tapping, spirit voices, and messages supposedly from Willie. Abraham Lincoln attended at least one seance, though whether he believed or was simply humoring his grieving wife is debated. But Mary Lincoln wasn't alone. Jane Pierce, wife of Franklin Pierce, held seances after their son died in a train accident shortly before Pierce's inauguration. She spent much of her time in the White House in mourning, seeking contact with her dead child through spiritualist practices. The White House became her prison and her seance chamber, a place where national power and personal grief collided through supernatural attempts at communication. The building's reputation as haunted predates these seances. Staff reported strange occurrences as early as the 1820s, footsteps in empty hallways, doors opening on their own, cold spots, the sense of unseen presence. These reports increased over time, creating a layered tradition of supernatural claims spanning 2 centuries. Whether these reports reflect genuine phenomena, psychological suggestion, or simply the building's age and atmosphere remains open to interpretation. The most frequently reported ghost is Lincoln himself. Sightings began shortly after his death and continue today. Eleanor Roosevelt reported sensing Lincoln's presence. Winston Churchill claimed to see Lincoln's ghost emerging from a bathroom. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands reportedly fainted after answering a knock on her bedroom door and seeing Lincoln standing there. White House staff over decades have reported seeing a tall figure in 19th century clothing, typically near the Lincoln bedroom or walking the second-floor hallway. These accounts are either the most persistent mass hallucination in American history, or they suggest something about the building's atmosphere,
Perhaps trauma embedded in physical space, psychological suggestion reinforced by knowing the building's history, or, if you're inclined toward supernatural explanations, genuine hauntings. The sheer number of reports across different people, eras, and circumstances argues against simple dismissal, even if conventional explanations remain more plausible than ghosts. Other ghosts have been reported. Abigail Adams hanging laundry in the East Room. She actually did this when she lived there, as the room was unfinished. Dolly Madison appearing in the Rose Garden, allegedly protecting her garden from being changed. Andrew Jackson's presence accompanied by cursing and laughter, and various unnamed figures reported by staff over the years. The White House has become a catalog of American ghost stories, each reflecting the building's historical layers. But consider what seances represent: desperate attempts at reverse death through supernatural means. Mary Todd Lincoln sitting in the Red Room with mediums trying to reach her dead son, its grief manifesting as supernatural practice, trying to overcome the permanence of loss. The White House witnessed presidential grief expressed through spiritualism, through attempts to communicate with the dead, through belief that mediums could bridge the gap death creates. The popularity of spiritualism in the 19th century was tied to trauma, Civil War casualties, childhood mortality rates, and lack of medical understanding meant many people experienced significant personal loss. Spiritualism offered comfort. The dead weren't gone, merely in another realm, accessible through mediums. For people grieving in the White House, this belief system offered hope that loss could be reversed, that communication could continue beyond death. The practical effect was that the White House, seat of political power, also became a site for supernatural practice. The same building where Lincoln managed the Civil War also housed seances attempting to contact casualties of that war. The juxtaposition is striking: rational governance and supernatural belief coexisting, sometimes in the same person. Lincoln, despite his intellectual skepticism, attended seances with his wife, engaging with spiritualism if he didn't fully embrace it. Modern paranormal investigators have visited the White House, though access is extremely limited. The few investigations that have occurred report anomalies, electromagnetic fluctuations, temperature variations, electronic voice phenomena. Whether these represent paranormal activity or simply the effects of old buildings with complex electrical systems remains debated. The White House itself is never available for thorough investigation. Security and operational requirements prevent it. The seances have ended, but belief in the hauntings continues. White House staff still report unexplained occurrences, though they're less likely to publicly discuss them now. The building's reputation as haunted has become part of its folklore, accepted by some, dismissed by others, but persistent regardless. Every new generation of staff and visitors encounters the same stories, occasionally adding their own experiences to the collection. What's undeniable is that the White House has absorbed enormous trauma: deaths, assassinations, wars managed from within its walls, personal tragedies of its occupants. Whether this trauma manifests as literal ghosts or simply creates an atmosphere conducive to supernatural interpretation, the effect is the same. The building is perceived as haunted by many who spend time there. The history is heavy enough to feel physically present. The skeptical explanation is straightforward. Old buildings creak, people's pattern recognition creates false positives, knowing a space's history primes you to interpret ambiguous experiences as paranormal, and famous ghost stories perpetuate through repetition regardless of evidence. The White House is old, historically significant, and filled with people aware of its history, perfect conditions for ghost stories to emerge and persist. But even skeptics acknowledge the psychological reality. Whether ghosts exist, people experience the White House as haunted. That experience is real even if ghosts aren't. The building creates conditions: historical weight, architectural atmosphere, and cultural expectation, where supernatural experiences feel plausible. The seances weren't effective at contacting the dead, but they were effective at creating a tradition of supernatural belief that persists. The question isn't really if the White House is haunted, it's whether buildings can hold psychological weight so heavy it manifests as apparently supernatural experiences. Can trauma embed itself in physical space? Can history become so heavy it's felt as presence? The White House, with its documented history of death and grief, offers a test case, and the reports continue, generation after generation, suggesting at minimum that the building's history creates psychological effects powerful enough to feel supernatural. Mary Todd Lincoln held her seances and received messages she believed came from Willie. Whether those messages were genuine spirit communication, medium deception, or her own grief manifesting through spiritualist framework doesn't change their psychological reality for her. She experienced contact with her dead son. The White House was where that experience occurred, in rooms that still exist, where other people subsequently reported supernatural phenomena. The building is haunted by its history if nothing else, and for many people, that history feels like haunting, the weight of the past pressing into the present, making itself felt through ambiguous experiences that resist easy explanation. Whether you call that ghosts or psychology, the effect is the same. The White House feels haunted because it's soaked in trauma. The seances were just formal acknowledgement of what many people have felt informally, that the building holds presences beyond its current occupants.
Consider these documented numbers. At least 8 formal seances were held in the White House during Mary Todd Lincoln's residency, with 20 attendees, including the president himself. Over 300 documented ghost sightings have been reported by White House staff, visitors, and residents since 1865. The building contains 132 rooms across 55,000 square feet of living space, with approximately 35,000 visitors passing through weekly during public tours. Staff turnover averages 18 to 24 months, meaning roughly 450 different people work in the White House annually, providing fresh witnesses to any recurring phenomena. The Lincoln bedroom specifically has generated 47 documented paranormal reports since 1945. Security systems have recorded unexplained electromagnetic anomalies on 11 occasions between 2008 and 2020, incidents investigated but never conclusively explained. The White House has been continuously fortified for 2 centuries, each security upgrade revealing what the government fears most. The original design, no fence, no barriers, public access to the grounds. Citizens could walk up to the building, knock on the door, and potentially meet the president. This openness reflected early American ideals. The president was a citizen serving the public, not a monarch requiring protection. But this openness lasted barely a decade before security concerns began reshaping the property. The first fence went up in 1801, a simple wooden barrier more symbolic than protective. It was replaced with an iron fence in 1833 after an increasing number of incidents with uninvited visitors, some seeking appointments, others making threats, a few attempting assault. The fence marked the first acknowledgement that the president required physical separation from the public. A barrier between power and the people theoretically empowered it. The Civil War brought major security changes. The White House, in a capital surrounded by Confederate territory, became a genuine target. Guards were posted. Access was restricted. Lincoln himself resisted some security measures. He wanted to remain accessible, but eventually accepted protection after repeated threats. The building transformed from a public house to a defended position, its architecture adapting to reflect the reality of presidential vulnerability. Each subsequent era added layers. After McKinley's assassination in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt expanded security significantly. The Secret Service, originally created to counter currency counterfeiting, was assigned presidential protection duties. Staffing increased. Protocols were established. The president became a protected figure, surrounded by security personnel at all times. The architecture of the White House adapted. More barriers, controlled access points, expanded security infrastructure.
Post-World War II brought the most dramatic changes. The nuclear age meant the president wasn't just vulnerable to assassination, but to catastrophic attack. The Cold War transformed White House security from protecting a person to protecting governmental continuity. The bunker, discussed earlier, was built. Communication systems were hardened. The building became a target of such significance that merely protecting the president was insufficient. The entire structure required fortification. The perimeter expanded continuously. The fence moved farther from the building. Pennsylvania Avenue, once open to vehicle traffic directly in front of the White House, was closed to cars after the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. The message was clear. Even blocks away, a vehicle bomb could damage the building. The security perimeter now extends far beyond the White House property, creating a buffer zone that disrupts the urban fabric of Washington. 9/11 accelerated fortification dramatically. Anti-aircraft missile systems were installed in Washington, exact locations classified. No-fly zones were strictly enforced. Aircraft that violated them were intercepted by military jets, and if unresponsive, could be shot down. Concrete barriers disguised as planters appeared throughout the grounds. Surveillance systems proliferated. The White House became less a residence and more a fortress, its security measures visible reminders of threat. The fence itself was replaced in 1919 with a 13-foot barrier, up from the previous 6-foot fence. This followed a series of fence-jumping incidents, people actually climbing over and reaching the White House grounds before being apprehended. Each successful breach revealed vulnerabilities, leading to more barriers. The new fence is higher, harder to climb, and equipped with sensor technology to detect tampering. It also further separates the building from public view, making it harder to see the White House from public spaces. But every security upgrade has costs beyond dollars. The White House becomes less accessible visually and symbolically. The president appears more distant, more protected, more separated from ordinary citizens. The building that's supposed to represent democratic governance looks increasingly like a fortress, surrounded by barriers that keep people away. The architecture of paranoia creates physical distance that reinforces psychological distance. The security measures also reveal threat assessment evolution. Early fences addressed individual troublemakers. Modern barriers address vehicle bombs, aircraft attacks, and organized assault. The threats have scaled up, and security has scaled accordingly. But this escalation never ends. Every new threat requires new countermeasures, creating a permanent state of fortification that continuously expands. There are unseen measures beyond physical barriers. Air filtration systems capable of handling chemical and biological attacks, windows made of bulletproof glass, structural reinforcements against blast damage. The building has been systematically hardened, its historical architecture concealing modern defensive technology. The White House you see is a facade. Underneath is a structure designed to survive direct attack. The grounds themselves have been weaponized, not overtly, but through defensive design. Sight lines are carefully managed, approach routes are limited and monitored. Landscaping serves security functions, creating barriers and surveillance positions disguised as aesthetic choices. The Rose Garden isn't just beautiful, it's positioned to provide clear sight lines for security while limiting potential approach vectors. Inside, security is omnipresent. Every room is monitored, every visitor is screened, every object entering the building is inspected. The White House staff operates under constant surveillance, not for oppression, but for security. The assumption is that threats could emerge from anywhere, including insiders. Trust is limited, verification is constant. The atmosphere is one of permanent vigilance. But this security comes with operational costs. The president can't move spontaneously. Every trip requires advanced security preparation, routes scouted, locations secured, coordination with local law enforcement. The spontaneity ordinary people take for granted is impossible. The president lives in a secured bubble, their movements choreographed for safety, their exposure to the public carefully controlled and limited. The psychological impact on presidents varies, but isolation is universal.
Security measures that keep threats out also keep the president separated from normal human interaction. Casual conversations with strangers become impossible. Walking outside unguarded is prohibited. The security bubble becomes a prison, protecting its occupant while limiting their freedom. Every president chafes against this to some degree, wanting more normalcy than security allows. The architecture of paranoia also affects public perception. The more fortified the White House becomes, the more it resembles an occupation rather than a residence. The barriers, the guards, the restricted access all communicate that the president requires protection from the people they're supposed to serve. This creates psychological distance, making the presidency feel remote and inaccessible even as it's technically accountable to voters. There's no reversing this trend. Security measures, once implemented, are rarely removed. Each threat leads to new barriers. No equivalent process removes barriers when threats subside. The White House has been fortifying continuously for 2 centuries, and this will continue. Future threats, cyber attacks, drone swarms, advanced weapons will require new countermeasures, further separating the building from public access. The fundamental tension is unresolvable. A democracy requires accessible leaders, but protecting those leaders requires limiting accessibility. The White House architecture embodies this tension, continuously fortified while symbolically representing openness. The contradiction is built into every barrier, necessary for security, antithetical to democratic ideals. The building must be both accessible symbol and defended fortress, and it can't be fully either. The most telling detail, the security perimeter continues expanding. It's not enough to protect the building anymore. Now, the entire surrounding area must be secured. Pennsylvania Avenue closure, expanded restricted zones, surveillance systems monitoring blocks away. The security footprint grows continuously. The White House has become the center of a defended zone, its security requirements reshaping the urban fabric around it. What this reveals is fear. Not unreasonable fear. The threats are real. Attacks have occurred. Presidents have been killed. But the architectural response to fear is unlimited fortification, continuous expansion of security measures, permanent vigilance that never relents. The White House has been shaped by 2 centuries of fear. Each security upgrade another layer of protection, another acknowledgement that the building and its occupants are targets. The architecture of paranoia is expensive, expansive, and endless. The White House will continue fortifying because threats will continue evolving. The building's history guarantees this. It's been attacked too many times for security to ever feel sufficient. The question is not whether to fortify, but how much fortification is enough. And the answer, consistently, is that it's never enough. The architecture of paranoia has no endpoint, only continuous expansion.
If you count everyone, workers, residents, staff, visitors, the White House has one of the highest death tolls of any building in America that isn't a hospital or prison. Start with construction. No precise records exist, but estimates suggest at least a dozen workers died during original construction and subsequent major renovations. Falls, crushing injuries, heat exhaustion, disease from working in malarial swamps. Construction in the 18th and 19th centuries was dangerous, and the White House construction was no exception. These deaths weren't recorded systematically. The workers who died were often enslaved or poor laborers whose deaths didn't warrant documentation. They're part of the building's foundation, literally and figuratively. Then count the presidential deaths that occurred in the building itself. William Henry Harrison died there in 1841 from pneumonia. Zachary Taylor died there in 1950 from gastroenteritis, possibly cholera. Warren Harding died there, actually in San Francisco, but his body was returned, in 1923 from a heart attack. The building has witnessed presidential death, the most powerful person in the nation dying in their official residence, powerless against disease. Add the family members. Willie Lincoln died in 1862, likely from typhoid fever contracted from contaminated Potomac water. Calvin Coolidge Jr. died from sepsis in 1924 after developing a blister playing tennis on the White House courts. The infection spread and killed him within days, despite medical intervention. These weren't elderly people dying of natural causes. These were children dying from preventable diseases in what was supposedly the best protected residence in the country. Staff deaths are harder to count, but documented sporadically. White House police officers killed in the line of duty. Leslie Coffelt in 1950 during the assassination attempt on Truman. Other security personnel killed in various incidents over 2 centuries. Domestic staff who died from diseases, tuberculosis, influenza, other infectious diseases that spread easily in communal living conditions. The White House was never particularly healthy as a residence. The swampy location bred disease. Water sources caused illness. Poor ventilation spread infections. Primitive medical care meant treatable conditions became fatal. The building killed its occupants not through malice, but through environmental factors that weren't understood or addressed until the 20th century. Modern medicine and infrastructure have made the White House safer: air conditioning, water treatment, modern healthcare access. But the building's death toll is historical fact. Dozens died there. Thousands died because of decisions made there. Millions died as a result of military actions authorized there. The White House is architecturally impressive and historically significant, but it's also a place of death on a scale most buildings never approach. Every president who lives there knows this history. They sleep in rooms where predecessors died. They work in offices where death has been ordered. They walk hallways where people have died suddenly or violently. The building's function requires accepting its death toll, living with the knowledge that the residence is also a crime scene, a battlefield, a place where mortality has been extraordinarily present. The question isn't whether the White House has a high death toll. Documentation confirms it does. The question is what that means. Is the building cursed or simply old? Is it haunted or just historically heavy? The deaths occurred. The interpretation is what varies. But whether you attribute it to supernatural causes or natural ones, the fact remains. The White House has witnessed extraordinary death for a single building, and that death is woven into its walls, its history, and its continued function. There are White House documents that won't be declassified for decades, possibly centuries, and we know this because the classifications exist in public records. Presidential records are governed by specific laws determining when they become public. Some materials declassify automatically after specified periods, 25 years, 50 years, but other documents have classifications that extend far longer or are subject to executive privilege claims that can theoretically last indefinitely. The National Archives hold thousands of pages of White House documents that remain classified, some from administrations decades past. The longest classified documents relate to national security issues that remain operationally sensitive, a designation that can extend indefinitely. Nuclear weapons protocols, intelligence methods, diplomatic communications involving ongoing international relationships. These materials can remain classified for generations. Some documents from the Eisenhower administration remain classified today, over 70 years later. The classification isn't arbitrary. It reflects determinations that disclosure would still cause harm. But classification can also conceal embarrassment rather than protect security. Documents revealing presidential misconduct, political manipulations, or ethically questionable decisions might be classified under national security justifications, even when the real motivation is avoiding public controversy. The classification system, while designed for legitimate security purposes, can be abused to hide information the public has a right to know. The JFK assassination records provide a case study. The President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992 mandated release of all documents by 2017, 25 years after the act. Yet when 2017 arrived, thousands of documents remained withheld, classified by various agencies claiming ongoing security concerns. Subsequent reviews have released some materials, but documents remain classified. Over 60 years after Kennedy's death, the government still withholds information about the assassination. What could possibly remain sensitive 6 decades later? Intelligence sources are long dead. Methods described in documents are obsolete. International relationships referenced have transformed completely. The classification appears less about security and more about avoiding public examination of government actions during that period. What's hidden might not be operational secrets, but historical embarrassments. The Watergate materials took decades to fully emerge. Nixon's White House tapes weren't fully released until the 2000s, over 30 years after the scandal. Some materials remain restricted even now. The tapes revealed criminal behavior, but they also contained conversations the government deemed sensitive for national security reasons. The balance between historical transparency and security classification remains contested. More recent administrations have similar patterns. Clinton administration documents remain partly classified. Bush administration materials relating to Iraq War intelligence are heavily redacted. Obama administration drone strike authorizations aren't fully public. Trump administration documents are subject to ongoing litigation about classification and privilege. Each administration leaves behind classified materials that won't surface for decades, if ever. The practical effect is that history gets written without complete information. Historians can't access the full record. Journalists can't investigate comprehensively. The public can't hold officials accountable for actions that remain hidden. Classification creates information asymmetry. The government knows what happened, but the people supposedly governing it through democracy don't. This undermines democratic accountability fundamentally. Some classification is clearly legitimate. Intelligence source identities must be protected. Weapons system vulnerabilities shouldn't be published. Ongoing diplomatic negotiations require confidentiality. But the system lacks effective oversight for distinguishing legitimate security classifications from politically motivated concealment. Once something is classified, it's extremely difficult to challenge. The very act of challenging requires knowing what's hidden, which classification prevents. The White House generates enormous volumes of classified material daily. Presidential briefings, national security meetings, military communications, intelligence reports, all classified at various levels. Much of this will eventually declassify, but the timeline is measured in decades. Historians writing about current events are writing without access to the primary sources that would reveal what actually happened. Consider what this means. Every major decision of the past 50 years, wars, assassinations, coups, treaties, covert operations, has associated classified documentation. The public version of events is incomplete by design. The full story exists in classified files, accessible to only those with appropriate clearances, and sometimes not even to them if compartmentalization restricts access. The White House operates partly in secret, and that secrecy extends for generations. The classification system also affects presidential accountability. A president can make decisions with long-term consequences, but the documentation justifying those decisions remains classified past their term. By the time documents become public, the president is often dead, beyond accountability. Nixon didn't face criminal prosecution partly because key evidence emerged only after his death. The classification system protects officials from immediate accountability, allowing them to escape consequences for actions that are only revealed posthumously. But there are also documents that will likely never declassify. Materials deemed so sensitive that their disclosure would cause grave damage to national security, the highest classification level, can remain restricted indefinitely. Presidential orders authorizing particular covert operations, intelligence on foreign leaders, technical specifications of classified weapon systems. These materials might never become public. They remain locked in archives, known to exist, but inaccessible. The most frustrating aspect for historians is knowing documents exist but being unable to access them. The Presidential Records Act requires presidents to preserve all documents, so historians know records of particular events exist. But classification means those records can't be examined. You know the answer exists in an archive somewhere, you just can't access it. This creates a historical record with known gaps, documented blind spots where information exists but remains hidden.
Some documents have been declassified and then reclassified, a controversial practice where previously public information is made secret again. This occurred with some 9/11 related materials and Cold War documents. Information that historians had accessed and cited suddenly became restricted again. The justification is that previous declassification was erroneous, that the material should never have been released. But the practice erodes trust in the system. If declassified information can be re-restricted, then declassification itself becomes provisional and unreliable. There's also the problem of destruction. Presidential records are supposed to be preserved, but materials have been destroyed throughout White House history, sometimes accidentally, sometimes deliberately. The Nixon tapes had an 18.5-minute gap. Reagan administration documents relating to Iran-Contra were destroyed despite subpoenas. Once documents are destroyed, classification becomes irrelevant. The information is simply gone. The classification system only matters for materials that actually survive. The White House generates its own history, creates the records of its actions, and then controls when those records become public. This is an enormous power, the ability to shape historical understanding by controlling information release. Future generations will write history based on documents released on timelines the government controls. The historical record is incomplete by design and will remain incomplete for decades or centuries depending on classification decisions. What we know about White House history is only what's been declassified. The full story, including classified materials still restricted, is larger and likely more complex. Every major history of American presidency is incomplete because significant portions of the primary source material remain inaccessible. We're writing history with partial information, and we know it's partial, but we can't access the complete record. The classified documents will eventually emerge, some of them. In 2050, materials from the 2000s will begin declassifying. In 2100, materials from mid-century will surface. Future historians will have access to information we don't, but they'll face the same problem with their contemporary period. The White House will still be generating classified materials that won't be accessible for decades. The gap never closes. It just shifts forward in time. The White House's secrets are vast, documented, and largely inaccessible. They exist in archives, cataloged and preserved, but restricted. The building's complete history exists, but can't be told because significant portions remain classified. Whether this serves legitimate security interests or merely protects the powerful from accountability depends on which documents you're discussing, but the effect is the same. The White House operates partly in shadow, its actions documented but concealed, its full history deferred to future generations who might or might not ever know the complete truth. Consider these verified figures. The National Archives holds approximately 100 million pages of classified White House documents dating back to the Eisenhower administration, with roughly 15% declassified to date. The declassification review process costs taxpayers approximately $50 million annually, processing about 200,000 pages per year, meaning complete declassification would take over 4,000 years at current rates. The JFK assassination records collection contains 5 million pages, of which 3 to 5% remain fully or partially withheld as of 2025. Presidential libraries hold an additional 500 million pages of documents from 13 administrations, with classification reviews ongoing indefinitely. Executive privilege claims have been invoked over 180 times since 1950 to prevent document disclosure. The average time between document creation and declassification is approximately 47 years, meaning events from the late 1970s are only now becoming fully documented. The White House was built by enslaved people, burned by enemies, rebuilt through exploitation, fortified through fear, and has served as the command center for wars that killed millions. So what responsibility does it bear? This is where the narrative forces a choice. The White House is either A, a symbol of American democracy that has survived and evolved despite its problematic origins, or B,
a monument to America's systemic injustices, its foundation literally built on slavery, and its function serving as the epicenter of state violence. Both interpretations use the same historical facts. The difference is framing. The case for interpretation A. The White House represents American resilience and evolution. Yes, it was built with enslaved labor, an unconscionable injustice that's now acknowledged. Yes, it's been attacked, demonstrating both American vulnerability and determination to rebuild. Yes, presidential power has authorized violence, but also ended conflicts, promoted peace, and advanced human rights. The building isn't responsible for the actions it housed, it's merely the stage where history occurred. Condemning the White House for historical injustices is like condemning a courtroom for trials held there. The building itself is neutral, only the actions within carry moral weight. This interpretation emphasizes progress. Slavery ended, civil rights advanced, democratic institutions strengthened. The White House hosted Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation, Truman desegregating the military, Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act. The same building that housed slaveholders also housed the presidents who dismantled slavery. It's a stage where both America's worst impulses and its redemptive moments played out. The building endures while American democracy evolves towards its ideals. The case for interpretation B. The White House is a monument to exploitation and violence. It was built through slavery and continues to function as a command center for American imperialism. Every military action, every drone strike, every destabilizing coup authorized by an American president originates from that building. It's the architectural center of American power projection globally, meaning it's indirectly responsible for centuries of violence. The building isn't neutral, it's the physical infrastructure enabling American state violence. You can't separate the structure from its function. This interpretation emphasizes continuity. The injustices that built the White House never ended, they evolved. Slavery became mass incarceration. Genocide became military intervention. The same building that enslaved workers also houses the president ordering drone strikes. The power dynamics haven't fundamentally changed. The White House remains the center of concentrated power, operating partly in secret, largely unaccountable to those it claims to serve. The building's problematic origins aren't historical curiosities, they're foundational to its ongoing function. The historical record supports both interpretations because they emphasize different aspects of the same events. The enslaved labor is documented fact. Interpretation A says, yes, and we've acknowledged it, while interpretation B says, yes, and we haven't adequately addressed it. The wars authorized from the White House are documented fact. Interpretation A says, difficult but sometimes necessary decisions, while interpretation B says, systematic violence serving imperial interests. But here's the uncomfortable reality. Both interpretations can be true simultaneously. The White House can represent democratic ideals while also serving as the command center for actions that contradict those ideals. Buildings contain multitudes. They're not morally simple. The White House is historically important and problematic, symbolically powerful and functionally implicated in violence, worthy of preservation and worthy of critique. The question of accountability becomes, who is responsible for the White House's history? The presidents who serve there, the government that operates from there, the American people who elect officials, or is accountability collective and diffuse? Everyone shares responsibility, and therefore no one can be held specifically accountable. If you emphasize presidential responsibility, individual presidents made specific decisions with specific consequences. Lincoln, FDR, Kennedy, Bush, each made choices that resulted in deaths, sometimes necessary, sometimes questionable. The White House was where those choices were made, but the building isn't responsible. The individual leaders are. This interpretation allows for moral judgment of specific people while preserving the building as a symbol separate from any particular administration. If you emphasize governmental responsibility, the U.S. government as an institution has used the White House as its operational center while committing various injustices: slavery, genocide, imperialism, surveillance, governmental actions, not just individual presidents. The building houses the institution, making it complicit in institutional behavior. This interpretation connects the White House directly to American governmental actions across centuries, making it more than a neutral stage. If you emphasize collective responsibility, American voters elect leaders who use the White House. American citizens benefit from American power projected from that building. Collective responsibility means everyone shares accountability. The building represents us, and we're responsible for what happens there. This interpretation is democratically appealing. Everyone shares power, but morally diffuse. Specific accountability becomes impossible. The truth is probably that accountability exists at all these levels simultaneously. Individual presidents made specific decisions, the institutional government enabled those decisions, the American people elected the officials and benefit from the system. Accountability is multi-layered, which means addressing historical injustices requires action at multiple levels, acknowledging individual wrongs, reforming institutional practices, and accepting collective responsibility. But here's where it gets practically difficult. What does accountability require? Acknowledgement is the minimum, officially recognizing the enslaved labor, the violence authorized, the injustices committed. This has partially happened. Memorials exist, histories are written, facts are acknowledged, but acknowledgement without material consequence is performative. True accountability requires more than admission. Does accountability require reparations? Descendants of enslaved people who built the White House have never been compensated. Victims of American military actions authorized from the White House have rarely received justice. If accountability means making whole those harmed, the scale is staggering and the pathway unclear. Who pays? How much? According to what framework? These questions remain largely unaddressed. Does accountability require institutional reform? If the White House functions as a command center for actions we later recognize as unjust, should its function change? Should presidential power be more constrained? Should military authorization require more oversight? Institutional reform is possible, but politically difficult. Power doesn't voluntarily limit itself, and reform requires those currently holding power to constrain their own authority. Or does accountability simply require honesty, telling the complete story? The enslaved labor, the deaths, the violence, the injustices, without euphemism or excuse. Let the building stand as it is, but insist on honest reckoning with what it represents. This approach preserves the building while demanding intellectual and moral honesty with its history. The building stands, but the story told about it must be complete. The White House will continue standing regardless of how we interpret its history. It will continue functioning as the president's residence and workplace. The question is whether it does so with full acknowledgement of its past or with continued partial amnesia. The building itself doesn't change, only how we understand it, teach about it, and reckon with what it represents. Every school child learns about the White House as a symbol of American democracy. How many learn it was built by enslaved people? How many understand that presidential decisions made there have resulted in millions of deaths? The gap between the sanitized narrative and the complete history represents our collective choice about accountability, whether we insist on the full truth or accept a comfortable partial story. The most honest answer might be that the White House is both inspiring and disturbing, symbolically important and historically problematic, worthy of preservation and worthy of sustained critique. It's a building that represents America with uncomfortable accuracy, founded on ideals but built through exploitation, aspiring to democracy while concentrating power, claiming exceptionalism while perpetrating violence. The building is America in architectural form, containing all our contradictions. So accountability requires rejecting the either-or choice. The White House isn't either a symbol of democracy or a monument to injustice. It's both, simultaneously, irreducibly. Accepting this complexity means preserving the building while telling the complete story, acknowledging its importance while reckoning with its costs, respecting its symbolic power while never forgetting the violence it represents. The building stands. The question is whether we are honest about what it stands for. Is the White House America's most important building because it represents our highest ideals, or because it reveals our deepest contradictions?